Why would anyone want to be a seafarer? I think mostly because it's an honourable profession. We need seafarers. We can denigrate the profession and we can say, sort of don't be a seafarer. But we need seafarers. We can't live without them. And it's not the only profession in the world that's hard, where people have to give a lot of energy in uncertain times. There are lots of other very honorable professions as well, but we name them essential workers, not just for fun, but because they are essential workers, and it's an honorable profession. I think we should really push that side of things, that being a seafarer is good for all of us.
Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Hello, Shipping Podcast lovers, and welcome to episode 166 of the Shipping Podcast. If you're here for the first time and you want to make sure that you don't miss out on anything, follow the Shipping Podcast on your podcast platform of choice, and then you become part of the tribe that gets to listen to new episodes as soon as they are released. We have just celebrated the Day of the Seafarer on June 25th. And in the last episode, you could listen to Frank Coles and his view on a fair future for seafarers, as that is the theme for this year's Day of the Seafarer. In this episode, you will be listening to Dr. Jason Zuidema. He is the Executive Director for the North American Maritime Ministry Association, and you can hear his view on what is essential to make sure that seafarers can look forward to a fair future. After we finished our chat, I asked Jason if there was something more that he wanted to bring up, and fortunately, I recorded his reply, where he makes a call for support of seafarers. So if you just hang on, after the outro from me, you can listen to Jason's view on small acts of kindness. I could not withhold that from you. But we start with our conversation about what can we do for the seafarers so that they can look forward to a fair future. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Jason Zuidema. I wear two hats. One is as Executive Director of the North American Maritime Ministry Association, often known as NAMMA, and also I serve as the General Secretary of the International Christian Maritime Association, or known as ICMA.
It's a lot of abbreviations there. What is your responsibility at NAMMA?
Yeah, so I serve as Executive Director, and NAMMA is the association of all the seafarers' welfare associations in North America. And we serve to help with advocacy, with professional development, and bringing them all together in a network. And ICMA is really the worldwide group of the same thing. So the seafarers' welfare associations around the world. And you might know, your listeners might be more familiar with our members as part of ICMA, the Mission to Seafarers, Sailor Society, Stella Maris, the Deutsche Seemannsmission, or the other Nordic seamen's missions around the world. So we have 27 members within the ICMA family, and it's a joy to be able to serve seafarers in hundreds of different ports.
How did you end up in the shipping industry?
Well, I'm one of the people that knew almost nothing about shipping before I came to start as an intern in the Montreal Seafarer Center in 1997. So it's been almost 25 years since I began, and when I began, I knew nothing. I didn't know what a seafarer was. When I first heard that word, that was a foreign word to me. I had to think about what that even meant. I had vaguely knew something about ships and vaguely knew something about the sea, but had no real connection to the sea before that. So coming that first summer and learning about the maritime industry by meeting not just seeing the ships and the moving parts and the containers, but meeting real people from all these different countries was an eye opener, and I'm still involved in it today.
So what are the biggest changes that you have seen? I mean, you have 25 years experience almost.
I think a few of the biggest changes, one has to do with security, and then the other one has to do with the length of time in port. So when I started, things were already changing. It wasn't as if it was the good old days then, and now it's bad. The maritime industry is always changing. There's always new things happening in the maritime industry. But when I started, it was before the ISPS code. It was before September 11th and some of those other worldwide security challenges. And so getting on board ships as a ship visitor, as I was in those years before 2001, was relatively simple, relatively straightforward. There was easy access to seafarers, and we could go as volunteers easily. I could bring groups of volunteers on board. I could easily do ship visits with others. The access was quite easy. And so obviously with ISPS code, with developments in ports, it's now more challenging to have access to ships. And people have to be a lot more, one might say, dedicated to get in North America, especially in the United States, but in other countries as well. You need more training. You need more identification. You need there's just more of a sense of professionalism of ship visitors now than there was before. The second point is about the length of stay of ships. Previously, 25 years ago, but especially earlier than that, seafarers might have stayed a week or longer in port. Loading and unloading took quite a long time. And then, so there was lots of time to come ashore, to interact with seafarers, to come to the Seafarer Center. I used to spend whole evenings playing billiards and ping pong and hanging out with seafarers, and that's changed now. The turnaround times in ports is much tighter. The loading and unloading time is less, and this thing called the internet now has taken over our lives and everyone's lives, and so definitely seafarers want access to the internet on board and in our seafarers welfare centers.
So if we think about the other way around, the seafarers on board, things must have changed for them as well in this period.
Definitely, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective. When I first began, we had the nightly duty of in my time zone, so it was the end of the day. But for a lot of the Filipino and Indian crew, it was the beginning of the day for their families back home. So much of our work each night was using telephone cards, using telephones so that they could phone home and have a 10-minute conversation with their families. It broke our heart often, not that they could only have short conversations, but sometimes they couldn't have any at all. The line wasn't good. Perhaps their family wasn't home at that time, and they hadn't spoken to their spouse or their kids for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they didn't have a chance to speak to them then, and it would be another 3 or 4 weeks before their ship would be back in port. That communication part has always been important in seafarers' welfare, but this has changed rapidly, drastically in the last 25 years because of modern communication tools. So gone are the days of payphones and telephone cards. Most seafarers now want some kind of a data-enabled SIM card, or especially they're pushing so that their employers, the ship owners, ship operators would provide some kind of free internet on board.
And that might be both good and bad as well, I understand. Because some people are talking about that maybe it gets more isolated because you are in your own cabin and you are looking into your social media and contacting your family, and you are not associating with the other people on board.
There have been new studies about that, studying that exact question. I'm fairly cautious about talking about this because I wouldn't want my employer to talk about my internet usage. And so I think sometimes shipping companies, but also the rest of us, might need to be a little bit cautious about regulating, what people do on their downtime. If my employer, was started commenting on what I do in my downtime with internet, I would probably not appreciate them commenting on it. So that's the first caveat I would say. The second thing I think is that it's important not to regulate what they don't even have. That is, there's studies now that show between 75 and 90% of seafarers have some kind of free internet. But before we regulate that internet, let's sort of go to the facts. The facts are that the internet they get for free is not very much. It's not as if most seafarers have high-speed internet access where they can play online video games, full HD, et cetera, like what we would expect at home, on land-based internet connections. What most seafarers have, insofar as it's free, is perhaps 1 gigabyte a month, or even less. What can you do with 1 gigabyte a month? Not very much. Where this conversation that we're doing right now is probably taking 1 gigabyte of data. Therefore, it's when some call for regulating the internet on board, I would just say that with caution that the seafarers are not necessarily getting all that much. There are good companies that are supplying great internet connections, and I really applaud those companies for going that extra mile. It's expensive, it's costly. I know as a ship ownership operator, it's expensive. It's not something that you maybe have to do, but it's something that is good to do. But there are so many ships and that have little to no internet. And indeed, there's still a 10, 15, 20% where there's almost nothing given by the ship owner operator. The seafarer has to get their own connection.
Well, my point was not to regulate it. My point was that even if you have the access, you might isolate yourself from the other crew members because that is where your focus is. And then you need to do something else to get the team building going on.
I agree, but I suppose this would be my last comment. This is not a seafarer problem. This is a human being problem. That is, I think whether it's a 20-year-old seafarer or a 20-year-old non-seafarer, this question is a significant question for us as the human race. How do we deal with the internet? How do we deal with social isolation? There's no doubt that the pandemic has just put an exclamation point on what was already the case. How do we navigate our lives online versus our lives in person? I'm a strong proponent of needing to have social contact and be together with people. In fact, it's really one of the things that pushes us as seafarers welfare organizations to do ship visits. That our ship visits are not just to give SIM cards or give transport. Our ship visits are also to be a friendly, personal presence in the lives of people who are disconnected from their families and friends. So our ship visitors, I think it's their gift of themselves that is as important as some of the other services that they provide.
There has been a problem with the crew changes. I think we need to talk a little bit about that. How do you see it from your end?
It's complicated. It's devastating. It's something that really urgently needs to be looked at. I think, unfortunately, what almost all countries realized at the beginning of the pandemic was they needed to tackle this as countries. That there was national, both in stopping the spread of the virus and now also in vaccination programs. Almost all of those responses were national, and what that meant was that borders became the borders were closed. And borders became the way of containing the virus's spread, and borders became the way of having some control over the vaccination of people. We can't vaccinate everybody, so who do we vaccinate? We vaccinate only our own people, and we fight, and we have the sort of vaccine nationalism, et cetera, that we've seen around the world. Well, the challenge is that we still all want the flow of goods. We still all want our essential things in our grocery stores and in our markets. We still want the essential PPE. And if that's the case, there are people that have to cross borders. We can't have it both ways. We can't protect ourselves and close and say that we don't want shipping. Shipping is essential for our protection. And so the call for seeing seafarers as essential workers has been so important for so many countries. And that has solved certain problems, but very unfortunately, we have lots of examples where countries designate them as essential workers and then do nothing to actually protect that their essential nature. And no doubt, often the problem is that those who are on the top declare they're essential workers, but they don't necessarily get that message down to the local border guard or the local airport worker who actually makes the decision to let somebody in or let someone through. So we thought the issues were getting better at the end of 2020, but now, very unfortunately, with the wave of the virus in India, which is now again, thankfully going down, but still it's caused a havoc on the repatriations and crew changes again.
From what I understand, in the beginning, the problem was that I can understand that the countries, it's some sort of legal system that we control this territory and the people who inhabit it. And then the seafarers and the people in the maritime industry are moving around. But the head of states, they didn't really maybe understand not the problem, but they didn't understand what was the problem with seafarers moving around in that way. Maybe someone in the government, like the Minister of Transport or Minister of Shipping or someone else, understood, because that was everyday work for him or her. And then, how can we... I don't know. I think maybe this is back to my soapbox. We need to raise the profile of the maritime industry. We need to be more proud. We need to stand up and talk about what we're doing, because maybe then people get the connection. We don't get our food to the stores or anything else unless the seafarers are actually key workers. That is my connection of the dots. I don't know if you agree or not.
I do agree. I think the challenge even before the pandemic was this, often we talk about it as something like sea blindness, where people are generally blind or unaware that the sea is so important for us. We're dependent on it in direct ways. Without realizing it, we would be economically crippled if our seaports were closed for any length of time. I think through the pandemic, we've seen the crew change crisis get really significant coverage in all the daily newspapers around the world. But the real peak really wasn't even necessarily the pandemic, but the whole situation surrounding the Ever Given in the Suez Canal. The intense media interest in that grounding was, I think, something that we might not appreciate yet. We might only appreciate it in a few years when that brings sort of the results of that whole media frenzy for those few weeks. I think that's something that is important. I find in many of the Seafarer centers that I work with around the world, our biggest issue is telling potential volunteers, potential supporters about the maritime world, that a lot of our work is just opening people's eyes to the importance of maritime, that without maritime, we would be in grave danger. All of our societies would be. Sometimes we speak of certain nations as maritime nations and other nations as not as much maritime nations. But to me, basically every country in the world is a maritime nation. There are certain that are bigger than others, no doubt, but all of us are directly related to and reliant on maritime.
Yeah, as long as we have trade and the continents have sea in between. We need to have something transported on the water. So we still have work to do. Okay. If we think about the future for seafarers then, because that is what the IMO is focusing on when it comes to the Day of the Seafarer. What are the unique selling points for becoming a seafarer? We need to promote the occupation in a way. We can't all be gloomy and say this is a problem, because then we will never have anyone who wants to come and work as a seafarer.
I'll preface with a negative, but then get to, I think, what is the most important positive. Throughout the pandemic, in the crew change crisis, a thing that I've heard over and over again was, it's not so much that we had to stay on board for an extra 1 or 2 or 3 months. It's not so much that. It was the uncertainty of it all. We just didn't know when we were going home. We didn't know when we could get shore leave. We just didn't know what was happening. And it's that uncertainty that was really unsettling for seafarers. And I've heard it in a number of anecdotal comments, but also academic reports, that uncertainty was a key challenge. And I think that's even pre-pandemic, the uncertainty of getting a new contract, who I'm going to work for, how I'm going to work, sort of making long-term plans for so many seafarers from different countries. That was a real challenge. And so now flipping around to the other side, why, therefore, in this climate of uncertainty, in the climate where you feel like no one's seeing you, that you're not being respected, et cetera, why would anyone want to be a seafarer? I think mostly because it's an honorable profession. We need seafarers. We can denigrate the profession and we can say, oh, sort of don't be a seafarer, but we need seafarers. We can't live without them. And it's not the only profession in the world that's hard, where people have to give a lot of energy in uncertain times. There are lots of other very honorable professions as well, but we name them essential workers, not just for fun, but because they are essential workers, and it's an honorable profession. I think we should really push that side of things, that being a seafarer is good for all of us. Does it have some drawbacks compared to other land-based jobs? Yes, sure. You're far away from family and friends. You have less internet access. There are challenges in being a seafarer, but you're part of a larger world that is essential in ways that some land-based jobs just aren't. And there is a sense of accomplishment, I think, that seafarers can have. And because it's an honorable profession, because it's of that sense of accomplishment that seafarers can rightly have, to me, that's why I'm excited to be part of the seafarers' welfare work. Most of the people that I work with are, again, it's not glamorous work, high paid work to be in seafarers' welfare. Most people, in fact, are volunteers in doing this, and they volunteer in order to bring some honor to seafarers, help the seafarers where they are, show them some respect, because I believe seafarers deserve our respect.
So what needs to change to get that uncertainty moved away from the picture when you think about becoming a seafarer? What do we need to change?
I think a key thing, again, highlighted in the pandemic, but it was already there before, is we have great international instruments and rules and regulations. The Maritime Labor Convention and other national laws are there. We're already there, but it's a question of being consistent on them and enforcing them when it's necessary. There's no reason. It's crazy to think that in 2021 we have seafarer abandonments. It's just crazy to think, how is this even possible that we have abandoned ships in this world? And yet last year was a record. This year is setting up to be a record again. It's just unbelievable that this is happening in this world. And I think the shipping industry, governments, everyone else needs to pull together to make sure that these abandonments aren't happening, or if seafarers are abandoning, we're doing our utmost to help them in those situations. I think we have the tools. It's a question of bringing the right people together and working for it. And I really salute all of the different groups in the IMO, ILO, and everyone else already doing these things. They already do amazing work. And I think putting even more effort on that to bring nations to the table who might not be showing the seafarers the respect they need.
But is the job as a seafarer also changing? I mean, I'm thinking about the digitalization, industry revolution, industry revolution 4.0, everything that is happening now, with everything from autonomous ships to machine, all of that changes the work as well as a seafarer.
You're correct, but I'm above my pay grade when commenting on this too much. I'm an armchair observer of all this, and I notice everything anecdotally, but I don't necessarily know all the ins and outs. But one thing I can sort of observe from the point of view of seafarers' welfare. So even probably 15 or 20 years ago, we were talking about autonomous ships, and we were talking about more technology on board ships. I would hear it at all conferences. And you would hear all the different technical descriptions of autonomous ships or all the other technology. Maybe we're still a long ways away from that. I don't know. Again, that's something that others on your podcast can answer better than I can. But one thing I do notice is that ship crews are already smaller than they were 25 or 30 years ago. When I first started, we could regularly still have ships of 30 to 40 people, where we would it would be wonderful to have a big group in the Seamen's Club late at night, and you have a big chunk of the crew. But we've already seen that the size of crews is much smaller than it used to be. So perhaps 5 or 10 less than it was before. Already, technology has eliminated certain of the folks that were doing communications on board ship, radio officers, and other. We've seen, especially in the galley complement is much smaller than it used to be, where you used to have a chief cook and maybe an assistant cook and various messmen, etc. Now you might have one, maybe two. Already, that's much smaller. There's kind of a sad side to that, because the galley often used to be the sort of socially the beating heart of the ship, and the folks in the galley would it was extremely hard work, but that's where all the fun and action happened. When you had a great chief cook and when you have a great team in the kitchen, then they're happy. There is happiness often on board ship. There's usually lots of seafarers that will say the food on board ship is the best morale booster around. But when you have less people working in the ship, in the galley, who need to do even more work, then it changes also the morale on board. So coming back to the question of technology, there are already less people in the last generation or two on board ship, far less people, and that has an impact when you realize, for example, a small container ship. And now these mega container ships have more or less the same size of crew, then it has a big impact. I note also these big container ships, one of the differences between smaller ships and these really mega container ships is that unless you're on the bridge, there's nowhere to go where you can have the sky above you. So when you're walking around on the deck on these mega container ships, you're underneath containers. You're not, you don't sort of see the sky above you. And that means lots of seafarers, again, sort of live in with something above their head for 9 months' time.
But I've been thinking about what would be a fair future. I would think that if there was a youngster who wanted to test out life at sea, I mean, it's not for everyone, I understand. Probably not for me, but for if it was a young person who wanted to go to sea, but you don't know your career path. I mean, maybe we could do something to make that a little less uncertain. This is how you do this, and there is people are talking about there are few female seafarers because you give birth and so on. But if there was a young woman who wanted to be a seafarer and she knew that there was also possibilities to continue a career on land and maybe come back to sea once your family has, all of that, how can we help young people to see that there is more than just being on that container ship and not see the sky?
Two comments, I guess. One comes back to my comment about uncertainty. People, if they, and I think this really gets to the heart of your question, people will do hard jobs if they know what the outcome is. If they know they'll get paid, if they know they'll when the contract is done, if they know what the benefits are, whether it's maternity leave or whatever the other social benefits are, and if they know that if there's an accident or something, they're protected. And the challenge is that there's unfortunately too many cases right now where that's not the case, where seafarers don't know if they're going to be paid. In the case of abandonment, in the case of speak to the ITF, and they'll give you many examples of seafarers who are weeks or months without being paid. That's incredibly destabilizing. And then all of the other questions about benefits, etc. There's questions there. And I think one of the key things in this is that it's not necessarily the shipping industry that's answerable to this, but it's national governments. That as I come from Canada, for example, and it's not only my employer who is responsible for these things, but it's my government. It's my local government or provincial government or federal government that takes care of me. And so often seafarers don't have those other certain benefits to fall back on. And so everything hangs on the salary and the benefits they get from their actual job. And so the first part, what I was going to say was the uncertainty of it. The second part is that getting national governments on board. To me, that's a really key thing, that it's not only the shipping industry that needs to solve all these problems, but lots of these problems are solved when national governments and the whatever levels of government that need to be involved provide that safety net that takes the edge off of the negative sides of things. So I know that if I lose my job, I have a safety net in my part of the world. I would imagine in it's many countries in Europe and others where there is a social safety net, that there's a backup plan. One might say a plan B, where for so many seafarers in the pandemic and in other crises, the plan B is not there. There's only plan A. Plan A is if I need a job on board ship, and that plan B isn't there. I think in the pandemic too, something that very few people are talking about, it's the repatriation issue is tragic and problematic. Crew change is problematic and really a big problem. But really, the humanitarian crisis is now seafarers who can't get new jobs, who are at home and whose money is run out. And we receive all the time requests from seafarers for this to please help me find a new job. And so, I guess going back to the fair future question, it's that the benefits are incredibly important. It's but thinking about sort of plan A and plan B, thinking about promoting good jobs for seafarers, and but secondly also working with national governments to make sure there is a safety net when seafarers, for whatever reason, in a pandemic or for personal reasons, can't get that job.
But it's a little bit about the maritime industry as well. I mean, it's fair enough for you and me. You're in Canada and I'm in Sweden. We have a social backup if something happens. But usually the seafarers might not, they are more from the developing countries maybe. So then we have another problem, because their best friend who is a farmer doesn't have a backup either. I mean, so there is a bigger problem. And as long as the seafarers are recruited from countries which do not have a stable system for all their inhabitants and so on, I mean, we will still have that problem then. So how can we in the developed world, if we call it that, I don't really want to say that, but how can we support the countries where the seafarers are recruited from?
This is a big and wonderfully complex question. Halfway, I don't. This is again. I would love to have a clear, specific answer for you to that just do this one policy and we can solve all these problems. Very unfortunately, I don't have that. One perspective, though, I will say is that in working with our network around the world, what we see is that the issues that seafarers face are often similar, if not identical, to the issues that many other workers face from those very same countries. So in the Philippines or in other countries, seafarers are just one among many other overseas foreign workers who face the quite similar issues going abroad. So the typically the husbands and the fathers will be seafarers, but the mothers and the sisters very often will be going to other countries, working in Singapore or Hong Kong or other countries doing similar work. It might be the other way around too. It might be men and women doing the different jobs. The point being that they all face very similar challenges in terms of that social safety net. And so I guess part of my point was that it's not just the maritime industry that is grappling with these questions, but it's much, much broader about overseas foreign workers from the Philippines or from India or whatever other country, all the other big labor supply countries in the shipping world. How to best protect your workers who are providing essential services elsewhere. Whether it's on ship or you're providing essential services as nurses or caregivers or working in all sorts of other construction projects, hospitals, etc.
Mm-hmm. So what is the best part of being a seafarer?
I think for many of them that it's a great job compared to jobs on land, comparable jobs on land for comparable training. Most seafarers will say this is wonderful when we get paid and when we can come home and support our families. So many seafarers are not just supporting themselves or even their spouse. they're supporting their kids, they're supporting extended family, and it's essential. Their work is essential for their families. And so that the stable career with good companies for the most part that brings home a real stable salary is really the thing that's the biggest driver for seafarers. I think the second thing is in the good times, when it's good. Right now it's not so good, but when it's good, shore leave is wonderful. Seafarers love to go to different countries and see new things. Exploring the world has long been something that's brought people to sea. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, that you can't really do very much exploring because this shore leave is often not permitted either by the company or the country right now. But traditionally, anyways, that idea of just getting around the world, flying to different airports, joining a ship, and enjoying this big, beautiful Earth are something that is, I think, really enjoyable compared to what we live now is working from a little office and not going anywhere. I think that can be an enjoyable part of the work.
How do you see the future for the maritime industry once we are past this pandemic and so on? How do you see that?
We've seen in the pandemic and still now that shipping is essential. We knew this before, but now in the pandemic, I would like to think more people know now than previous to the pandemic that keeping the lines of trade open are essential. We just our grocery stores and markets and all these the goods, they don't just fall from the sky, and we can't just count on them being there. But shortages happen when trade doesn't flow. We see it right now in the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, trade coming out of China, where everything is slowed down, coming into those ports. When everything slows down, things cost more, and you can't count on getting the goods that you want. So coming out of this pandemic, I think there will be a renewed appreciation that we need these lines of trade to stay open. And so there'll be, I think, renewed appreciation for the maritime world is important for us all. However, this being said, very unfortunately, in the pandemic, we've seen that sometimes that doesn't directly influence policy to make sure seafarers are treated as essential workers. I think even after the pandemic, they still should be essential workers. They still their essential nature, I think, was there before, is there during the pandemic, and should be there afterwards. And we should do whatever we can to facilitate that, whether it's signing off or signing on, whether it's helping them with shore leave, whether that's by national governments doing all they can to promote the maritime jobs and give more resources to either maritime schools or just making more resources available to make those jobs as easy as possible, to those careers as easy as possible to get into.
I totally agree. That's my problem. I usually agree with my guests. Who do you think I should interview the next? Who would you be interested in listening to in the shipping podcast?
Oh, there's lots of I think great folks that are out there. A fun little research report I did a few months ago was on seafarers who have video logs and who sort of document their life on board. What's so interesting about those video logs, and also there's seafarers that have blogs and write about what they work, finding a few seafarers that are doing these things to see what's life at sea really like. It's easy. Sometimes it's easy for me to talk about what life at sea is like, but truth be told, I don't really know all that much. I know anecdotally, I know what people have told me, but actually talking to seafarers about what their life day in and day out is about is really fun. So seeing those video logs is often really interesting for a few different reasons. One is you get to have the authentic voice of the seafarer. They're making the video, they're doing it. Often they're on board making it, and you get to see their life. But also you see how creative they are. There are so many seafarers now who have their iPhones, sort of basic technology that are doing really creative, fun things but there's also some that have much more advanced equipment and are taking extraordinary videos and photos and documenting life at sea in ways that if you haven't traveled, but if you haven't been a seafarer before, it's hard to get that perspective if you haven't actually been at sea before. So interviewing some of those seafarers, I think, could be really enjoyable and eye-opening.
Thank you. So if there are anyone who listens to this, please let me know. I will be chasing you otherwise. Thank you very much, Jason, for taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you, Lane. It's been really great to have a conversation with you.
Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate your view on what we can do to respect the seafarers and their work to give us a life without disruptions. Since the episode with Frank Coles apparently stirred up conversations all over the place, I have decided to make a third episode focusing on the same topic, a fair future for the seafarers. I have received so many comments, both good and bad, but when I received a message from the Captain John Conrad, the CEO of G Captain, on the episode with Frank, I invited him as a guest to my podcast. So, third time lucky. That episode will be released on July 16th, so you have something to look forward to. Don't forget now to listen to Jason and his call for how you can support the international seafarers in your local port. Thank you for listening. From me to you, over and out. Did I forget something, or was there anything else you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I think the last few of the questions is sort of we want to bring around peace in the world, and I think that's these big questions get they're so enjoyable to talk about because there are little things we can do. I think one of the chaplains in my network loves to point out that the work of seafarers' welfare, as we do it in ports, is not about big, giant efforts that we do, but it's a series of small acts that show kindness to individual seafarers. And I really love that, because I can't bring about peace in the world. I can't bring about a social safety net in some other country. I can't do any of that. But what I can do is do small acts of kindness that show kindness to one crew member, one seafarer. And I love that so much, because what it shows is that my respect for seafarers is not only seafarers in general, or seafarers sort of as some abstract notion, but that specific seafarer. I owe respect not to, in general, to the maritime industry, though I can respect it, but I owe also respect to that specific seafarer. It gives me nothing to say we should do more, when there are seafarers in my local port who are not being served, who have this very day some basic question, some basic need. And I think if anyone is listening, if you're near a port where there's a Seafarer Center, please go and volunteer. Please go and help. We need you. We need your hands. We need your help. If you want to support in another way, no doubt you can support your local Seafarer Center. But if there is no Seafarer Center in your port, start one. You have the power to begin anew something that might not be there. And so rather than sit on your hands and worry about all the problems in the maritime industry, go to your local port and be that person who brings about change. You have the power to do it, and you can partner with others to do it. So small acts of kindness really do have a big impact.
Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast available, and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.